Hello, welcome back to my studio. Today we're painting this fun winter landscape. The first thing I do is using a pencil, make the line of the mountains in the background, and then wet the paper from the very top of the paper down to the line of the mountains. If you try to use just the round brush, it takes a lot of work, so I like using an oval mop brush for this, but if you don't have one, go ahead and use whatever brush you have to get that paper as wet as you can without making puddles. I kept the light on so that you can see the shine of where the paper is wet. And then we're using a cobalt blue with a number 12 round brush. And this cobalt blue I mixed with just a little bit of water, so it's not quite as bright at first. It's a little thinned out so that the blue is not quite as bright on the paper. So it gives more of a sky blue effect. And I'm wiggling it down the paper. This gives it the illusion of motion, a little bit of movement to the sky. And then in areas where there's too much color, I dab the paintbrush onto the paper towel, and I'm able to pick up some of the extra color, and maybe there's pooling a little bit too much water, so I'm able to soak that back up and wipe it off on the paper towel. For this next step, I've mixed my black grape with my phthalo blue, and I'm using just the tip of my number 12 brush, dragging it along and dabbing it a little bit along that dry border of the mountains where the dry mountains meet the wet sky. And this allows for that mixture to bleed up into that wet area and give it that fun, smooth, wet on wet drying effect. For the next layer of mountains, I'm using that number 12 round brush just to show you that you can do an area of water with it. If you don't have a mop brush, that's okay. It just takes a little bit more work to get the area really wet. I'm using the same mixture of the black grape and the phthalo blue. If you don't have these two colors, you can use any black and any blue. This black just happens to be more of a bluer black. Some blacks can run more brown looking. It just depends on what pigments they use to make the particular colors. This black is more of a cooler, bluer black. And then if you don't have phthalo blue, you can use any other dark blue that you have, maybe an ultramarine blue. I'm adding just the black to that area after I'd filled it in with a combination to add some shading to the area so that it looks more like a forested mountain area in the background. I went straight into the pan with the brush and I'm dabbing in that black right into the still very wet, kind of blue-gray of the mountains, and I'm dabbing it in areas where the shadow is the darkest to give it a little bit more of a three-dimensional look. And I'm not dragging the paint across, I'm just dabbing it in very gently, very lightly, like little angel kisses. Just a super light touch into the already wet paint. When I'm happy with that, I'm salting those mountains so that when they're dry, you can see here it's completely dry. You're able to use your fingernail or a butter knife and rub the salt gently off of the paper. In the same area that I had the wash of the cobalt blue, I'm making a light wash of that black and phthalo blue mixed together to make a blue-gray for the snow going down. In my mind, it was a ski slope, but it could just be the side of a snowy mountain so that you'll be able to see that that snowy mountain is coming into the foreground and it has some shadows. We'll be adding a couple more areas, so it might look a little funny at first. And then I'm bringing a line all the way down to the bottom of the page, not quite to the corner, but almost, and making it just a little bit bumpy so that it looks like an edge of another mountain or snow-covered mountain. And with the same wash, we're going to be putting in the shadows on the mountains in the distance. I put down the shape of the shadow and then rinse out the wash from my brush, dry it off a little bit, and using just a bit of water, I'm pulling out that shadow to go down the side of the mountain, being careful not to touch the mountain that I created right below it. I don't want that watercolor to run up into our new wet shadow areas. Then I do the same thing for the other mountains where I start off with that same wash, and I'm careful to not cover up or paint over the very top of the mountain so that there is a line of white at the top of the mountain. And then I'm very careful not to paint over the mountain below it so that I'm not creating a shadow on the top of it or allowing that paint to become wet again and possibly run up into the mountain, the shadow that we're creating. I continue to use the same wash and to be careful not to go up to the very top of the mountain. You want to keep that line of white separating the mountain from the sky, as well as not painting into the mountain down below. I then put a little bit more of that wash on my brush and I'm dabbing it into the shadow to charge it with just a little bit more color. Then rinse it out, going back into that darker wash with the black and the blue. I'd say it's about 50-50, maybe a little bit more blue than it is black. And I'm creating another area of forested mountain. This area I want to look like it's a little bit closer. So with just the very tip of the brush, I'm making little teeny tiny strokes, lines down. So just line, just little tiny strokes down, and I'm making it look like it's the very tippy top of the trees that you can see in the distance on this forested mountain. And then as quickly as I can, I am making sure that the whole area is still very wet and filling it in. If it dries out while you're doing this, that's okay. You could just go right back over it with the blue and black wash and it will still look great. You just want to make sure the whole area stays wet because we are going to be using salt on this area as well. I am adding some black straight from the pan so that it is an even darker area and trying to make it look like it's not quite as flat, that it has a little bit of dimension to it, 3-dimension, and it has a little bit of more of a look of a mountain in the background rather than just a flat triangle. So after you're happy with your mountain, I'm again salting my trees. And this time, because I started off with the paint right on the paper instead of the water first, and it was thicker and it dried more quickly, the salt didn't create as big of a texture, and that's fine. Every time you do it, it will look a little different depending on how wet your paint is when you put the salt down. You'll never get the same results twice. So I think that's part of the fun with it though. For the pine tree in the foreground, I used a ruler to make a straight line down, and then using a thicker black wash, I first follow that line down, and I try to make sure I have a lot of water and paint on the brush so that my brush strokes aren't drying straight away. So I'm making like little puddles of paint. That way, when I add more puddles of paint to them or little tiny dots of paint next to them, they can kind of flow together. If some dry, I'm not too worried, but I'm using a larger uh, round brush, the same round brush as I was using before, that number 12, so that I have a lot of water and paint on my brush as I do this to try to be as free flowing as possible so that the little dots that I'm making can flow into each other the more when I add dots that are side by side. So I started off with just dots straight down the trunk of the tree, and then the dots that I have on either side, I tried to make them to be even and gave myself a bit of, maybe you could say like a fence, a bit of a blueprint so that I don't go too wild and crazy with my branches. So I know about how wide I want my tree to be. And then once I have that down, I'm starting at the tip of that branch, and the dots are getting bigger and bigger the farther they are towards the center, and they're getting smaller and smaller the farther away they go from the center. The tree is made up of just a lot of little dots of watercolor, little dots of that black wash. There are many, many ways of making pine trees with watercolor. This example here uses little tiny dots where the dots are smaller at the tips of the branches, and then they get closer together and a bit bigger the closer they get to the center of the tree, to the trunk of the tree. My game plan for making pine trees is a little bit different each time. I really love all the different ways that there are to make them. Feel free to make this in any way that is appealing to you. You could do little swishes, little brush strokes out. You could do more of a swoop to each little dot. The way that I'm doing it just felt right with this painting, and I thought might be an easy way to show a beginner how to make a pine tree, but it might not be the easiest for you. There are so many tutorials on YouTube on many different ways of making pine trees. This one I just thought was pretty simple, and after some practice, kind of easy to get the hang of. You just want to make sure that for each branch you put on one side of the tree, you put a branch on the other side as well. You don't want it to be a mirror image. You don't want it to be too exact, but you do want it to be balanced so it doesn't look like one side of the tree is too much thicker or heavier compared to the other side of the tree. For the trees in the distance, I'm using that same black and starting off with a straight line or straight-ish line. You can see why I like to use a ruler. But for the two trees in the distance, you'll start with a straight or a straightish line down. And then with that same number 12 round brush, or a smaller brush if you would like for smaller texture of your tree, you'll go ahead and do the same tiny little dots, but you won't leave space in between the dots. They will all be connected so that it looks like you're not seeing as much detail because they are farther away in the distance. Again, there are many, many ways of making pine trees, so feel free to make these in any way that you're comfortable with, or maybe you want to try out a new way of creating pine trees. But in this way, it's just those little tiny dots all along the trunk of the tree, the center of the tree, and then little branches made up of little clumps of dots, getting wider and wider as you go towards the base of the tree and where they're cut off by that snowy mountain in the foreground. After washing your brush, we're going to use that same wash that we used for the mountains in the background for the shadows in the snow in the foreground, meaning the area closest to you in the painting. So we're using that same light wash of blue mixed with the black, the phthalo blue mixed with the black. I think it might also be pretty if I had used the cobalt blue, or maybe added some of that to the shadow as well to tie it in from the sky to the snow. I think I could have done a better job with that in this painting, but I'm making some very smooth, wiggly shapes in the snow, all going the same direction as the slope of the hill and across it a bit as well, so that it looks like there is some shadow in the snow, so that it doesn't just look like a flat area. It gives it some a little 3-dimension to it. And then I'm adding a little bit more of the blue straight from the pan right into that wet area of shadow, so that it gives it a little more interest to the shadow, a little more depth to the painting. And then I blotted out just a little bit with a paper towel. I thought it was just a little bit too dark, and then brought it back down again with the brush. I'm adding just a tiny bit behind the tree, but being careful not to go into the tree so that that black paint of the tree does not spread out into the white area or the wet area of the shadow. For a fun pop of color, I decided to put a very thin light wash of yellow into the sky, mainly just into the white areas right above the mountains and a little bit into the clouds that are moving up into the sky. To do this without making water lines when it dries, I used a paper towel to pick up a bit of the wet area so that it made a softer look as it dried, so that it didn't have harsh drying lines that you can leave behind when you add a glaze or a final top layer of color. So I'm picking it up a bit with the paper towel. I wish my hand wasn't in the way so that you could see what I'm doing. I'm picking it up. I'm putting the painting down, or the paint down, the yellow paint down, and then I'm picking it up with the paper towel just very gently. So I'm not picking it all back up, but just enough so that it's leaving it damp on the paper, but not super wet. So it doesn't have that super wet drying outline that you get, so that it has a gentle, soft look, and it's hard to tell where the yellow stops and the white starts. So here I'm dabbing it again. I'm not picking up all the yellow back from the paper, but I am picking up a lot of it so that it does not leave like a watermark or an area where you can see where that newly added wet area has dried in the sky. And it just leaves behind like a touch of that color. So it leaves a bit of a glow, but it doesn't leave the outline of that new wet area. I add a bit of that same yellow glow to the snow on the mountains, in the distance, in the middle ground, and in the foreground as well. Thank you so much for joining me today for this painting. I would love to see your work. I am on Facebook at Elizabeth Bostick, and then I also have a page, Elizabeth Bostick Art, or I'm on Instagram also at Elizabeth Bostick, where you can tag me in the painting or send me a message with your painting in it, especially if you have questions. I hope that you enjoy this, and I will see you next time.